Hi, sorry about formatting. I'm on my phone. And again, this may be kind of long, so sorry for that too. Now for some context though. This whole thing started in 2005. I was 14 and ended in 2011 when I was 20. In the summer and fall of 2005, my grandparents had moved into a tiny mobile home park, kind of in between two small towns. At the end of the road they live on, a shopping center was still being built, and at the time there was only a Target store. Keep this in mind because it is truly where the story begins. Being as I stayed at my grandparents' home quite often, I think 3 to 5 days a week usually, and it was the only store out there, we were quite frequently visiting there. No specific employees ever stood out to us, nor do I remember ever seeing, let's call him Alvin, there. Within a few months, Save Mart, if you're not in California, it's just a basic grocery store, was added to the shopping center, now making 2 stores out there. And naturally, since Save Mart has cheaper groceries than Target, we began to shop there instead. This is where Alvin made himself known, whether he intended to or not. I can't tell you how many times we would go down random aisles and this dude would just show up. At first he would act like he was just restocking shelves or cleaning, but eventually he would just stand there and stare at me. And he would do this in every aisle we went to. Then as we would leave, he would refuse to let anyone else bag our groceries for us, and would still bag the groceries and follow us to our car, even if we refused the help. This went on for months, until just as quickly as he made himself known, he quickly disappeared, or at least we thought. As time went on, things were quiet, and I eventually started seeing Alvin again around Save Mart, but he no longer did that weird stuff like before. In around 2009 to 2010, I got into more of the internet and social media scene and became quite into a site called My Yearbook, and was actually quite popular on there, and would get multiple friend requests a day. So when I got a request from a guy named Alvin, given I never knew this guy's name, no alarm bells went off. I frequently would exchange phone numbers and sometimes meet people from My Yearbook, and eventually began texting with Alvin. For over a year, we texted and nothing more, but we were able to have a good flow of conversation and talked about life. I found out he worked at Save Mart and tried to figure out which one. There's a few in my hometown. So that maybe one day when I was out running around, I could stop off and say hi or something. But he kept refusing, so I let it go. Eventually, New Year's Eve 2010 rolled around, and I was having a party with my best friend, her brothers, and a few of our other friends, and I invited Alvin. He tried to say he worked late and didn't know if he could make it, but I was determined to get him over to the party. I talked him into showing up, and when he did, I instantly regretted it. My best friend and her brothers, let's call them Leah, Randy, and RJ, knew all about this guy and how weird he'd been. And when he showed up, and I realized who he was, I did my best just to enjoy the party without interacting with him much. My friend's brother, who I'd had kind of a thing with, stayed right with me, but so did Alvin. And the whole night, no matter how many times my friends tried to interact with him and get him away from me, he wouldn't budge. He wouldn't speak to them or even acknowledge them. He literally just stood there and stared at me the whole time, and besides saying hello when he came in, said not one other word to even me. It came down to midnight. We did the countdown where Randy and I made a big show about kissing and all that, thinking it would throw him off. It didn't. He stared even when that happened, and finally Leah and RJ came up with a plan to pretend all of us were going to bed now, and then told him he needed to leave. Luckily he did, and then again, just like before, he seemed to disappear. Around November I had gotten, and lost, my first job, which afforded me to buy a car. Grandma and I were still shopping at Save Mart, but Alvin wasn't bothering us really, except for again occasionally seeing him around the store where he would speak to my grandma, but not to me. This particular day though, he hadn't followed us at all, and I thought us leaving would go over without any appearance from him. I was wrong. He came over, began begging our stuff, even though we said no, and then began not only following us to the car again, talking to only my grandma about how I needed to apply at Target, because when they first opened, he worked there, and if I put him on my application as a reference, I'd definitely get the job. And of course, I had seen through his manipulation tactic, but my grandma, unfortunately, not so much. She kept going on and on about how I should do it. So I explained to her everything that had happened, and not only did it shut her up, she took my side. Long story short, I applied without his reference and got the job, but had to turn it down for a better opportunity. He began following me around the store again, and I a few times would say hi, just to let him know I knew he was there. And eventually he did ask me to hang out under the guise of it being with a group hangout with him and some of his coworkers. It was all a lie. When I showed up, which was my biggest mistake, but I was a bored 20-year-old, and my boyfriend at the time encouraged me to go because he wanted to make some more friends. It was just him. I sat at a table in the donut shop for around 20 minutes before I made an excuse and left. He asked me to hang out again about a month later, and since he'd stopped following me around the store and acted semi-normal the last time I agreed, we met at Starbucks around 9:30. They closed, and I walked to my car thinking, cool, that's that, and I can go home now. But no, he invited me to his house. I said no, but he's also said his mom had homemade cookies and stuff there and wanted to meet me. So I thought, fine, I'll go get a cookie and leave. Bro, he told his parents and siblings I was his girlfriend. The whole time I kept correcting them and telling them no, I'd already had a boyfriend and Alvin was not him. They just kept ignoring it. So I panicked and hid in the bathroom on the phone with my then boyfriend, trying to figure out how to get out of there. My boyfriend said to say there was an emergency and leave, then come straight to his house. I did just that, and all night, Alvin wouldn't stop texting me and tagging me in random Facebook posts about love and relationships. I blocked him on all socials I had back then, and turned my phone off and went to bed thinking, never again. He began not only following me around the store again, but if I was out anywhere, he'd show up there. Like one day I was getting snacks and an energy drink at a convenience store, and in he came. His excuse, I saw your car outside and wanted to come say hi to you. And that wasn't the first or only time he did that. Finally, my boyfriend and my boyfriend's dad threatened him to make him leave me alone, to which he sent me a long text about how me not being with him was a mistake, because he was apparently a children's pastor, rich, and owned his own house. Oh, he also later on his text diatribe he sent admitted to not only having unprotected sex, which I'm not against, you do you, but having it with the underage girls in his youth group. WTF. No, just absolutely no. He again disappeared at Save Mart, at least for me. When my grandma or grandpa would go in without me, he would relentlessly hound them about how he had a large bank account and how his parents bought a house for him and that they needed to make me break up with my boyfriend and be with him. When my grandpa exploded on him one day about leaving me alone, he then started in about, well, true fake adult has a sister, she was a minor at the time, and I could date her. At this point is where both my grandparents filed complaints against him to his supervisors, and where they learned they weren't the first. Multiple female employees had either complained about harassment or left the job completely because of Alvin. Luckily, this led to him getting fired, and I haven't seen him since. Last I heard through the grapevine is that he'd knocked someone up, one of those teenage girls in his youth group, and married her. So Alvin, I hope we never meet again. I live in a large city in Canada where I go to university downtown. I take the Landrail train back and forth between home and campus. It is usually a 15-minute walk between the train station and my house, but I need to cut between an apartment building scheduled for demolishment and then a very tiny stretch of trees in order to reach the path that runs beside the tracks. My train station is next to a recreation facility used for volleyball and basketball. The train is partially underground, partially above ground, and I get off at the station directly across from my university. However, it is often quite sketchy as it is downtown and my city is quite well known for its crime rate. I'm a sciences student and often find myself in the lab until later in the evening. Because it is winter and further north than most Canadian cities, it gets dark really early. I usually call my mom or boyfriend in my walk to the train, as I've had several creepy encounters in the past, one of which I was waiting at the light to cross the street to the train, and a homeless man approached me and got really close to my face. At the time, my mom was in my headphones, so she heard him say, "You have really pretty eyes." It was almost comedic when my mom said, "Run," in the same tone as that song where the beat drops after a run. Luckily for me, there were other students present, and it never escalated after he walked away, after I just muttered a quiet "thanks" and shuffled away from him. Everyone who takes public transit in a large city knows that there is your fair share amount of homeless and druggies you just avoid eye contact with and continue on. This experience I'm going to tell you about was much more serious and a lot more sinister. One morning, in the dead of winter, I was walking to the train in the late morning. There were a lot of people walking, so I felt pretty secure and didn't pay too much attention to the man in the long black coat and gray gloves that was walking in the same direction as me after the abandoned apartment buildings. I boarded the train along with another dozen people. It wasn't until that night that I realized I probably should have been paying closer attention. I had a late lab, so I took the nearly empty train home well after rush hour. It was around 8:30 or 9 p.m., so it was dark and there was a decent amount of snow coming down. I got off the train at my stop along with a group of young people, and we were walking to the building in clumps. I didn't notice the man from that morning immediately because as I started on the path, I was looking at my phone to dial my mom for the walk. I should have been paying more attention because I didn't actually notice him until he stepped directly in front of me to intercept me along the path. I looked up, startled. The man was wearing a long black wool coat, gray mittens, and a gray toque. He looked to be in his late 20s to mid-30s and had a closely trimmed brown beard and brown hair stuck out from under his toque. He smiled at me, but his blue eyes looked cold and desperate despite it. I immediately started running through my imaginary scenarios on what to do and took a quick glance over my shoulder to the university athletes who were almost to the rec center and steadily getting further away from me. The man and I were very nearly alone. He said to me, "You're very pretty to be out so late. Where are you headed to?" My heart dropped. I really wish I was witty or good at thinking fast on my feet because all I said was nowhere. He acted as if I didn't say anything and took a step towards me, still smiling that creepy smile of white death and dead, cold eyes. "I can walk you home if you like." I just stared at him in horror and he continued, "You live that way, don't you?" and pointed in the direction of my shortcut through the trees by the old apartment buildings. At this point, it clicked that this man had followed me from the apartments to the train this morning. He knew which station I'd get off and which path to wait for me on my way home. All I knew at this point was I could not let this man know where I live, and I couldn't go home through the isolated shortcut where he could do God knows what to me. Instead, I made a blatant lie and said, "No, I have practice." I was hoping my backpack and general university student look would be enough for me to sell it, as I quickly turned away and scurried after the student athletes. As I got to the doors, I turned to look at the man. He hadn't moved and was staring at me. I've never seen that look in a person's eyes before. It was so malicious, and his smile was replaced by a sneer. As soon as I was inside, I darted towards the largest group of people I could find and called my sister, who I was living with at the time. I told her what happened and asked her to come pick me up. I had a sneaking suspicion that the man was still waiting for me to attempt to walk home. She said she was driving on her way home from work and was about 5 to 10 minutes away, but she picked me up right outside the rec center doors. It was the longest minutes of my life as I started at the facility doors, waiting for the man to come in looking for me, but he never did. My sister called me when she pulled up, and I pretty much ran from the building to her car, and she hit the lock button as soon as I was in. The drive home follows my usual walking path for a while, but forks off close to my shortcut through the woods. As we drove past, I gasped and pointed out the indistinct shadow of a man among the trees. I knew it was him, and I knew he was waiting for me. I never saw the man again, but now whenever it is dark out and isn't busy hours for commuting, I get off at the next station and walk home from there as I walk beside a very busy street. Even though it is 5 minutes longer to walk, it is worth it. I never want to see those cold blue eyes ever again. Hey everyone. So I'm a guy from the UK. I live in a town in Wales, albeit not a little village as most people imagine. My town is a popular holiday destination along the coast of Wales. This isn't overly relevant to the story, but I just thought I would give everyone some context. I did actually post this story on a separate Reddit account several years ago in a different subreddit. However, I highly exaggerated it for the sake of story, and this was a creative writing subreddit, I believe. I can't fully remember. I just remember the story I told wasn't totally honest. So if you think you've read something similar before, then you probably have. This, however, is the full truth of what happened, and is likely way less exciting than the original story, but here we are. So it started when I was around 15 years old, so about 8 years ago. I was dating a girl from about 2 towns over. I would usually get the train to hers and back. However, this one night, her family wasn't supposed to be home, and we were kind of being watched by her brother, who was about 19 or 20 and was pretty chill. The plan was to stay the night. We were up late playing on the Wii, but her parents unexpectedly came home. I never got along with her mother, and the whole thing kind of got heated, and I was kicked out of the house and told I couldn't stay over. It was about 2 a.m., and I didn't want to call my own parents and worry of waking them up. My mother is a very strict woman, so I began the long trudge home. It was roughly about an hour and a quarter worth of walking, so I was expecting to be home by around 3:30. So I walked along the weird concrete bit just above the beach, not sure what it's called, and I stopped after about half an hour of walking, as there was a public toilet which is kind of run down, but also open 24 hours, and I was desperate. I was expecting it to be empty, or just have a homeless dude sleeping in it, but I was wrong. There was a guy using the urinal. This guy looked to be in his mid to late 50s maybe, a little on the overweight side, but not extremely. He had gray, messy-ish hair, but other than that, he looked pretty normal. He definitely didn't look homeless. I remember he made a quick joke about something, but I don't remember what. I politely laughed, did my business, and left. After about another 15 minutes of walking, the weather had gotten pretty bad. It started to rain heavy, and the wind was picking up. I seem to remember this was around November time, so it was pretty cold. Anyways, so I'm walking, and a car drives by, beeps, and pulls over just in front of me. I had assumed it was someone I know, but couldn't think who. Got to the car, and the dude from the toilet was inside. He asked me where I was headed, and I told him. He said that was a long walk, and I couldn't be expected to walk all the way in this weather, and he offered me a lift. In hindsight, I probably should have refused, but the weather was bad, and at the time, he wasn't giving off any weird vibes. The drive took about 15 minutes, I think, maybe 20. The more I was in the car with him, the more I started to get vibes that there was something off about this guy. He was telling me his friend was a 14-year-old lad who stays over at his place a lot, and they drink together, and if I ever wanted to join, I was more than welcome to. He was asking me some really invasive questions as well. I don't fully remember what they were. I just remember it's not the kind of questions that you ask to someone that you're just giving a simple lift home to. Anyways, we got to the street around the corner from my place, and I asked him to just drop me off there. I told him my house wasn't accessible by road and that I would walk the rest of the way. He gave me his number and told me to ring him when I got back to my house safely, as he wanted to make sure I got home okay. I asked him what his name was, as at this point he knew my full name, and he just said Pete. I said, "Pete? What? My phone wants a surname." He wouldn't tell me though. He just kept saying, "Just call me Pete." I later found out that Pete was a fake name too. Anyway, I got into my house and texted him just to let him know I was home safe. Probably a bad decision, but back then I was full of bad decisions, to be honest. The next day came and I was expecting everything to go back to normal. It didn't, because I stupidly gave Pete my number when I texted him. Starting to get texts back from him every morning, basically just saying good morning to me and wishing me well. I replied to the first few and then started ignoring them. He then started trying to ring me every single evening. I would ignore most of his calls, but he would often repeatedly ring until I answered. He was sending me these texts inviting me over to his house for some drinks. He kept telling me he'd just gotten himself a pool table and wanted me to come and play it with him. He was telling me a story of a friend he was playing pool with, the 14-year-old I was talking about, and accidentally let slip that the guy called him John. I collared him about this and said, "I thought your name was Pete." He said, "Oh, no, my friend's name is John." I said, "You just said your friend called you John, and you told me your friend was called Tom." He said, "Oh, well, some people call me John. It's like a nickname, but his name is John too." He hesitated saying this, and I kind of clicked that he was telling me a bunch of lies. I kept refusing, but he kept asking. After a while, my mom wanted to know who this dude who kept texting me and ringing me was. I told her, and she rang him herself from her phone and told him that if he carried on texting and ringing me, she would be calling the police. I didn't get any more texts from him after that, but it didn't end there. I had a routine, you see, and he knew it. I always walked my dog at 3:30 every afternoon. I played with her for about 40 minutes on the field at the end of my street, just near where he had dropped me off. I started to notice his car pulling up there within 5 minutes of me getting there with my dog. He had tinted windows, but I would always notice the car lights were always left on and the engine was always running. Also, I recognized his car. I would occasionally notice that the car door was open and a large flash from that direction was as if someone was taking pictures. I started changing the time I walked my dog, but he would eventually figure it out and start showing up either early or late to coincide with when I was walking her. And this went on for months. I never mentioned it to anyone, but one day, it just stopped. He stopped pulling up at the side of the field. I never saw his car anymore, nor text messages or phone calls from him. It all just stopped. I ended up getting a new phone after about a year and had that for another 2 years. I dug out my old phone when I was around 18 or 19. After the aforementioned dog died, I had some old pictures and videos of her on that phone and wanted to transfer them over to my PC so that I always had them with me. I turned on a phone which had been turned off for several years now and still had the old SIM in it. That's when I got my final message from Pete. It was an odd one. It was about 14 months old. It said something along the lines of, "Hi, I know we haven't spoken in a while, but I just thought you should know that over New Year, I was diagnosed with an illness and I've been told I don't have long left to live. You were a good friend in the short time we knew each other. I live at," and he sent me his address, "and would really appreciate it if you could come around just so I can have one last chat with you. I've got some beers in, and if it gets too late, you can stay the night. Just drop me a phone call when you want to come around so that I can get everything ready for you. See you soon." I have no idea if Peter John was genuinely ill or just trying to lure me to his house. Never been to the address he sent me and never responded to him or heard from him since. I didn't reply to him either. And that was the last I heard from the guy. So yeah, that's the story. Not tremendously exciting, but kind of had a big impact on me during those years. Hope you all enjoyed.